This is part 3 of AngularJS tutorial. In this video, we'll continue our discussion on controllers in Angular. In the previous video, we discussed the basics of controllers. The job of the controller is to build a model for the view. The controller does this by attaching the model to the scope. The scope object itself is not the model. It's the data that you attach to the scope is the model. So this is the same example that we worked with in the previous video session. Here we have our controller function. To the controller function, we are passing $scope as the parameter, and to that scope object we are attaching a message property. So in this example, the scope object is not the model, it's the message property that you are attaching to the scope object is the model. And then this model is available in the view. So within our view, we're using this data binding expression to retrieve the model from the scope. This means the controller is not manipulating the DOM directly, thus keeping that clean separation between the model, view, and the controller. So when you are writing code for controllers, one important thing to keep in mind is that you're not breaking that clean separation between those three components, that is the model, view, and the controller. The controller should only be used for setting up the initial state of the scope object and adding behavior to it. So far in this video series, we haven't looked at any example that adds behavior to the scope object. We'll discuss when and why should we add behavior to the scope object in a later video. In this example right here, we are attaching a very simple property message to the scope object. We can even attach complex objects like employees, customers, etc. Now let's look at an example of attaching a complex object to the scope object. So for that, what I'm going to do is create a variable here. I'm going to call it employee. So this is going to be our complex object. So this employee object is going to have, let's say, first name property, and I'm going to initialize that to David. It's also going to have last name property, and let's initialize that to Hastings, and finally gender, and let's initialize this to male. So we have our complex object right here. So what I'm going to do now is attach this to the scope object. So $scope dot employee equals the employee object. So we have attached this employee object to the scope object. Now we want to retrieve the properties, that is first name, last name, gender of the employee object and display that within the view. And to do that, we use the data binding expressions, the same idea. So within our view, I'm going to use the data binding expression. So let's first include a div element. So within the div, we want to display this literal text first name, and then I'm going to use the data binding expression. Now the key that we have used to attach the employee object to the scope object is employee, so I'm going to use the same key or property, whatever you call it. So we use employee, that's our model, and that has got first name property. Similarly, let's include two more div elements and display last name and gender. So last name is going to come from employee dot last name, and finally gender is going to come from employee dot gender. So let's save our changes and let's go ahead and reload this page. Now look at this, the view displays first name, last name, and gender of that complex object employee. Now let's understand what happens if the controller name is misspelled. So within our script here, we have a controller, and the name of the controller is my controller. And within our HTML page, so within this div element, we have used this ng-controller directive, and we specify the name of our controller again, my controller. So this div knows that this controller lives somewhere, and Angular is automatically going to call that controller. It creates this employee object, attaches that to the scope, and then within the view, we're using the data binding expression to retrieve the data from that model, in this case the employee. So everything is working as expected. Now let's see what's going to happen when I misspell the controller name. So I misspell the controller name, and I'm going to reload this page. Look at that. First of all, notice the data binding expressions. They are not evaluated. They are displayed as is. And then there's going to be another thing that's happening behind the scenes. An error will be produced by Angular. And to look at that error, launch the developer tools. And to launch the developer tools, I'm pressing F12 key. I'm using Google Chrome here. And first of all, notice we have got a cross here indicating that we have got one error. And then if you go into the console window, the error message will be displayed. So here we have the error message, but this message is not really very readable. We have got a lot of encoding symbols within that error message, and this is a URL. Okay, so when I click on this URL, it takes me to another page, and then on that page we can actually see much readable error message. So basically it's saying argument myController1 is not a function, got undefined. Now the first question that comes to our mind is, why is this error message not readable? That is because we are using the minified version of the Angular script. So if you are in the development environment and if you want more readable error messages, one option you have is to use the uncompressed version of the Angular script. So what you can do is go off to AngularJS.org, click on this download button, and here you have the option to download uncompressed version of the Angular file, which I have already done. I have downloaded the Angular file, and within the scripts folder, notice that I have an Angular script which says Angular.js without that .min extension. So this is the uncompressed version. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to remove this script tag from there, and I'm going to reference the uncompressed version. Okay, so let's save our changes, and now I'm going to reload the same page. So let's go here and reload this page, and now again we have that same one error. And look at the error message right now, it's more readable here. Argument myController1 is not a function, got undefined. So basically this is complaining that whatever you have this myController1 here, that cannot be resolved, it cannot be found. So what happens if the controller name is misspelled? When the controller name is misspelled, two things happen. An error is raised. To see the error, use the browser developer tools, and the binding expression, the view that are in the scope of the controller will not be evaluated. They will be displayed as is. Now let's understand what happens if a property name in the binding expression is misspelled. So basically, we misspell the controller name, and as a result of that we get an error. Let's put that back to what it is, valid value, and let's reload this page. Now everything should fall back in place. So we get the property names as expected, no errors. Now let's see what's going to happen if I misspell a property name on the model. So here we are using data binding expression, and within the data binding expression, gender has got this letters G and DAR. Now what I'm going to do is remove the letter R from gender property. So I have misspelled a property name of the model. Now let's go ahead and reload this page, and look at that. The first thing to notice is that we don't get any error. And look at the gender property on the view, it's not displaying the gender value. Okay, so this is one of the ways to know if the data binding expressions are working or not. You wouldn't get any errors. Okay, that's the default behavior. So what happens if a property name in the binding expression is misspelled? Expression evaluation in Angular is forgiving, meaning if you misspell a property name in the binding expression, Angular will not report any error. It will simply return null or undefined. That means on the view you don't see anything, and you don't get any error either. Now, how to create a module controller and register that controller with the module all in one line. Now if you look at this example right here, we are creating a module first, and then right here we are creating a controller and attaching the controller to the module. So those two things are happening in one line right here. Now is there a way we can create the module, create the controller, and attach that controller with the module all in one line? Absolutely, you can do that by using method chaining in Angular. So what I can do here is, this module function right here is creating the module, and then I can use method chaining like this. So Angular.module is going to create the module for us, and then I'm going to use another dot here and then use the controller function. So here I can specify a name for my controller. So the name is going to be my controller, and then we specify our controller function. So I'm going to copy this controller function and paste it right there. Let's throw in a semicolon there, and I'm going to get rid of the rest of the code from there. Alright, and let's fix this model property name here. So let's save all these changes, and when we reload this, everything should still continue to work the same way. So use method chaining to create the module, create the controller, and register the controller with the module all in one line. Thank you for listening and have a great day.